Morning, guys and girls. We know you're waiting, so I'm just going to give it another minute or two for some additional participants, and then we'll get started. Okay, I'm going to literally give it 30 seconds, and then those of you that have been kind enough to be prompt, we're going to get going. Okay, it's about 2 or 3 minutes past, so let's get started. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to what can sometimes feel like the mystery of bidding and tendering in the world of public sector contracts. This is one of a number of webinars we're running under the Hammersmith and Fulham Fit to Bid Business Support Programme, and it's all about helping you as local SMEs get more knowledgeable, get more experienced with the bidding and tendering process to hopefully then allow you to bid successfully for those larger contracts with both the council and also for private sector organisations within the borough. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Noshir Desai. I work for an organisation called Branduin. We're delivering the programme on behalf of Hammersmith and Fulham Council. And if you've seen me before, you'll know I'm somewhat old-fashioned in so much as I like to write things down. And I would encourage you to do the same during this webinar. So do make some notes. Obviously, I'm not a teacher there in presence of check, but it's up to you. And also make a commitment to yourself to do something as a result of what you hear in the session over the next hour. Because otherwise, why bother? Because I want you to take away something, an action that you will do to help you improve your bidding and tendering. And I'll ask you for details of what that is at the end of this session. So do that. I think you're familiar with the process. Keep yourself on mute. If you have any questions during the session, at the end for that as well. So that's a little bit of introduction. Let's get started. So let me try and summarise 40 years in 40 seconds. I really don't know where the time goes, but it's obviously going fast. So my background is banking. For my sins, I would of course say I'm one of the good guys, which I was. I've dealt with everything from startups and small businesses right through to international corporates. But where my bidding and tendering experience comes from is when I ran the government team for Lloyds. And that involved basically managing relationships in local authorities and also central government departments in London and the South East. And there was a lot of bidding and tendering for either new contracts or renewal of existing contracts. I'm an advisor with Branduin. We're a business advisory group based in London and the South East. And essentially, we run programs like these on behalf of councils and local authorities. I'm the project manager for this program at Hammersmith and Fulham, and I've worked on a number of other programs. I've probably done the best part of 200 one-to-ones in the last 2 or 3 years. So I've got a reasonable bit of experience from basically running and working those programs. I've been an advisor with the British Library, And I've also got a couple of my own businesses that I run. So essentially, I've got a small social care business. That's my sort of heartwarming stuff, helping old people. And of course, I also work on programs like this. So I guess the reason I'm telling you that is I've got a blend of, I guess, technical experience from my banking days and also some practical experience from having to run my own businesses. So 40 years in a minute. What are we going to cover today, this morning? We've got quite a bit to get through. I'll talk a bit about terminology. We'll go through the typical documents you'd see in a tender. We'll then run through a live example of an invitation to tender that we as Brandywin bid for and won. And I'll go through the process and the procedure and the sort of things we get asked on that. We'll look at evaluation methodology and meat. Nothing to do with butchers. As you can tell, my jokes are old as well as my attitude. And we'll also look at the timescales for tenders within the public sector. This is an interactive session to an extent, as much as it can be on Zoom. So we'll also look at your own business models, or give you a chance to do that from the perspective of tendering, what jobs need to be done. You'll get a chance to do a little SWOT analysis on your own business. And I'll also talk about social value, which is something getting increasing importance within local authorities, and consortium bidding. And finally, we've got an event we're running in January. I'll tell you a bit more about that. We can meet key people from the council and the private sector. So we've got quite a bit to get through, but hopefully you're going to enjoy it and have fun, because that's my intention for sure. So a little bit about the program. Essentially, it's all about helping you, as I said, to get better at bidding and tendering. I think some businesses, they treat the bidding tendering process as an administrative exercise. And let me tell you, it's not. There is some admin involved, of course, but I think if you treat it as an administrative exercise, you're going to be on the way to submitting a poor tender. So we talk about things like how to engage with procurement departments, because certainly in the local authority world, you'll always have the team, typically the procurement team, who are managing the tender process on behalf of the end users within the council. So we'll talk about what they look for, we'll talk about how you can engage with them, and essentially how you increase your chances of success. We have also an online bid capability assessment questionnaire, which we've developed. It takes you literally 5 minutes or so to complete. And if you haven't done that for your own business, I would encourage you to do that, because what it does is it allows us to assess your, I suppose, state of preparedness for bidding and tendering, and we'll give you a report which shows you where you perhaps need to sort of work on issues to get yourself more experienced and knowledgeable. And we can help you with that, of course. We'll talk about improving your bidding skills. I've mentioned it's a sales process. It's definitely that. And then the final point, the tender advice. The council also sponsor 2 individual one-to-one advice sessions for you and your business. So I'll talk again a bit more about that. So if you haven't registered for those, I'll give you my details at the end. It's quite simple to do. And finally, we have the Meet the Buyer event. So it's quite a far-reaching program. It's been running since February. It runs till February next year. So we're sort of coming towards the sort of back end of it, but there's still plenty of time for you to, learn, engage, meet the right people, and improve your tendering skills. So take advantage of what's there is what I'm saying. It's all free. So let me talk initially a little bit about some of the key differences, the differentiators between public sector and private sector bids. I mean, the fundamental sort of underlying process is not that dissimilar, whether it's public or private sector, but there's certainly a lot more, and you'll work out I'm quite straight talking, a lot more structure, if that's the right word, admin, dare I say, bureaucracy in public sector tenders. But as long as you know what those rules are, it's not that difficult. So initially, public sector departments, they'll have an annual budget they're allocated, which they have to spend. And that's why sometimes you'll see, as you get towards the financial year end for councils and government departments in March, they're quite keen to get things done because they have to spend their budget, otherwise it gets withdrawn. Whereas in the private sector, it's much more driven by their own business requirements. The public sector and local authority market is very heavily restricted by legislation, guidelines, laws, processes, where again, in the private sector, much more open in terms of the way it's operated. I touched upon process in terms of public sector departments, and it is a very specified, structured process, but with very clear unfortunately, prescriptive guidelines. And as long as you know what those are, and we'll go through them, then you're going to be putting yourself in a much better, stronger position. Whereas with the private sector, there'll typically be a free-form proposal which you submit back to the organisation. The timelines, again, for public sector, they're very clearly defined. They often slip. We'll go through a timeline to see and show you typically what you can expect. With the private sector, it's much more flexible. Public sector organisations have to be completely transparent. So whatever they're finding out from organisations, potential suppliers, they have to share with everyone else. So essentially, it's a very transparent process. In terms of key drivers, primary motivations to a great extent with the public sector is to spend money wisely. It's our money, it's taxpayer money, and fairly. You'll know that basically they're under increasing pressure. I think Jeremy Hunt will be standing up very shortly and telling them how much less they've got to spend and how they have to cut costs. So there's a real drive to basically be accountable and spend every pound wisely. Whereas the private sector, very much driven by return on investment, profits, shareholders, that sort of thing. In terms of stakeholders, local authorities are like a large corporate to an extent. They can be quite complex. You'll often be dealing with a number of different stakeholders when you're talking to public sectors about tendering. I said earlier that you're talking to procurement department, you might be talking to also the end users who are going to use the service, you might be talking to specialists within the council who have an interest in the project. So you're often having to manage a number of different stakeholders, but typically in the private sector, there might be one person who's responsible for managing the tender process. So it's quite different. And then finally, as I say, the focus for public sector organisations is typically reducing spend and savings. Of course, they have and want to improve their processes as well, whereas the driver in the private sector is typically increasing profit, improving returns, getting greater value for their shareholders. The somewhat unusual little diagrams along the bottom of the slide are things like social value, how we manage waste. Circular economy is something that you may or may not have heard of, but it's basically how we as businesses recycle, reuse, be more sustainable in terms of the way we operate. So you can see there are quite a few differences in terms of the way the public sector and private sector tenders and bids are managed. And I'll share with you this morning how you can make sure you tick all those boxes in the public sector. So let's talk about some of the key issues that are faced by SMEs. And just to let you know, this isn't something I pulled off Google. This is actual feedback that I and my team have had from the one-to-one sessions we've done with businesses like yours. So they're real examples. So let me just run through those in a little bit more detail. I hear companies, smaller companies, even sort of slightly larger, saying, they don't have experience in the public sector. They don't know how it works. Well, there is a lot of information out there. There's huge amounts of information on their website. They'll produce sector papers. Hammersmith and Fulham, for example, they've got definitions of what they look for in terms of suppliers. They provided information in terms of what sort of services they'll be buying, contracting over the next 12, 18, 24 months. They've all got social media platforms with lots and lots of useful stuff out there. Who the key decision makers are, the key influencers, all that type of stuff. So the point I'm making there is, and I accept it takes time, but if you're going to do this, you either do it properly or I'd say don't. The information is there for you to gain and increase your knowledge of the public sector. I hear companies saying, the industry is dominated by large companies. We can't get in. We're too small. Well, Hammersmith and Fulham, they have taken a strategic decision to direct more of their business to local suppliers like yourselves. So they've said that from a strategic perspective, this is what we want to do. Like all big organizations, like an oil tank, it turns slowly. I understand that. So behaviors will have to change. But the point I'm making there is you're pushing against an open door to a great extent in so much as they've said to the market, we want local companies like yours to benefit from the work we're putting out in the borough, rather than giving it necessarily to those larger players that perhaps nothing to do with the borough and don't have as a close interest. So Again, there are ways around this. Say, no one knows about my business, it's too small, the locals don't know about me. Well, it's just like any other relationship you're developing. Get to know the people, get to know the key buyers, the key influencers. In the sessions that we run, the one-to-one sessions, and in this Meet the Buyer session, we'll give you all the key contacts. We'll give you the details of who you need to speak to, and they'll start to get to build a relationship with you. You, of course, need to think about what's your message and what you can help them with, and we'll talk about that in a bit more. And that also helps you to reach the right people, because like I said earlier, they are quite large, complex organizations. So we'll put you in touch with the right people. There are often some practical considerations that you think, well, I can't submit a tender, I haven't got the time, I'm not sure about the process, I haven't done much marketing. Again, we can share, and I will share, the details of how you can overcome those challenges. And the other thing that's worth noting, and I hear from organizations, is that, well, I see they don't have evidence, they don't have reviews, testimonials, case studies of what they've done for other similar organizations. And you know what? Start building up those banks of evidence in advance. I won't go into it too much now, but I talk in a couple of other webinars I do of how every procurement department, if you say we're the greatest painters and decorators in Hammersmith and Fulham and we'll do a fabulous job for you, well, that's all well and good. But if you've got 10 clients saying that, so much more powerful. So start building up those case studies, those testimonials. The tendering process takes time, particularly if you're doing it for the first time. I know that. You'll find out if you haven't done it. But again, what I would say is if you're going to do it properly. So plan, make time. Again, I talk more about that in detail on other webinars, but essentially structure a simple Excel spreadsheet to meet those key milestones. Make sure the people that are going to help you are lined up. Plan and work towards a deadline submission of the day before, because you'll always run out of time. And then the final 2 points, a lot of companies say to me is, we don't really understand the tendering process. We're not sure what they're looking for. We don't know what to put in our bids to make them strong winning bids. Well, guess what? That's exactly what these webinars are all about, to help you. So in that box at the bottom, it talks about, I'm going to share some of the biggest secrets of doing business with government. Well, they're only secrets because you don't know. So I will definitely tell you a lot about what those tips, I suppose, and techniques and suggestions are, which should help you in terms of your bidding for public sector contracts. So there's lots of ways you can overcome these challenges, but it does take a bit of time, effort, and planning. So let's talk a little bit about terminology, because that can be pretty confusing, I have to say. You often get a pack of information. So to start with, the first thing you would typically get is what's called a PQQ, or a pre-qualification questionnaire. I guess it's a stage 1 questionnaire. And it'll ask you some fairly basic but specific questions about your company, like your insurance details. Have you worked on similar contracts? There'll be yes, no questions, but you have to answer all of them to make sure that you don't trip up at the first stage. They might ask you things about fraud and have you paid your taxes and all those types of things. Not particularly complex, but nevertheless has to be completed. And sometimes you forget about the PQQ and jump straight into what's called invitation to tender. And that's the key document, which is where you start to build, the detail of what service you provide, quality, what your costings are. It's where you price the job that's to be done. You answer technical questions about your ability to do the work in accordance with the scope. So that's the main document. We'll go through a live example of that, as I said earlier, in a few moments. RFP, request for proposal, quite similar to an ITT, where they analyze cost and qualities, but they're often used where the client either can't or doesn't want to define the scope of what they want up front. So it's a more general request. So in that instance, you as a potential supplier, you have to be more descriptive and clear in terms of what they might need to do. So it's a subtle difference. Next thing you might maybe see is a request for quotation. Lot like a tender, typically used for smaller projects, smaller scope, and often used when the contracting authority is looking for pricing information about a specific type of work. So much more narrow, much more detailed. And then the final two you may have come across, framework agreements. They're an agreement between one or more suppliers and organizations. And if you enter and get into a framework agreement, you'll be contractually bound to provide services depending on the buyer's requirements. And the final one, dynamic purchasing systems, very similar to framework agreements, but they're electronic. And essentially the key difference is there is that new suppliers can join that at any point, and it's run as a completely electronic process. And that is used exclusively in the public sector. So you won't see that in the private sector. So there is quite a lot of terminology, there's quite a lot of documentation, and sometimes it can be a bit confusing. Of course, you can Google this and read up a bit more if you're not clear. But just be clear on what you're being asked for and make sure you follow the instructions quite carefully. Like I said, we'll go through that. So, as I said, this is information from an ITT that Branduin submitted a tender for to provide business support training services, which we won. So I'll basically just go through the sort of things that you'll typically find in an ITT. And when the local authority is putting out an ITT, they're looking to assess, I guess, your suitability. So there'll be an introduction. There'll be an introduction about the background of the tender, what they're tendering for, why they're doing it. There'll be some tender conditions. There'll be all the legal parameter and stuff surrounding the tender. And then there'll be a detailed spec of what supplies, service, or work you as a potential supplier need to provide. There'll be some detailed instructions for all bidders. And as I said earlier, follow those instructions to the letter. So there'll be things like, of course, there'll be a timeline. Make sure if it says you've got to get your initial bid in by 12 noon on the 17th of November, don't put it in at 10 past 12. There'll be perhaps restrictive word counts. So in that situation, there'll be sections where they'll say no more than 300 words, no more than 500 words. Plan your response carefully. I was at a session last week for potential suppliers of Luton Airport, and they were saying very similar things, that they get calls from suppliers, literally 5 minutes before the deadline saying, I'm trying to press the send response and it's not working. Can you extend the deadline by half an hour? Never work to the deadline. Always work to, I would say, the day before, and give yourself some breathing space. There'll be the qualitative tender response. That's when you have to answer detailed questions about the service that's being contracted for and how you're going to deliver it. There'll always be a pricing and a delivery schedule. Repeat that carefully. And it's, again, not a case of cheapest price wins, it's the right price. There'll be a form of tender, which is a declaration that you as a potential bidder have to sign. There'll be typically a non-collusion certificate, which essentially is a certificate that says you as a bidder haven't colluded with any other bidder. So it's an independent tender that you've produced yourself. And then finally, you'll often have a draft of the proposed contract, which will ultimately be signed by the successful bidder. And you may also have an SLA, it's called a service level agreement, in terms of the standards they expect you to maintain under the contract. Excuse me. So lots of information. So when you get that tender pack, when I used to get tender packs within the bank, essentially, it could often be quite a thick pack of paper. You'd get yourself into a quiet room, you'd metaphorically put a cold towel around your head, and you'd literally go through it line by line and highlight all the key things and what needs to be done and by when, and start planning out how you're going to manage your response. So I would encourage you to follow some sort of similar process. So let's look at a bit more of the detailed ITT requirements. And essentially, the contracting authority will be assessing two key areas. They'll be looking at assessing your suitability as a potential supplier, point one. And secondly, they'll be looking at what's your methodology, what's your method statement. You may have come across that term. It seems to cause a lot of consternation, thought, concern, worry as to how do I put together a method statement. Again, we'll talk about how that works in a moment. So there's two key areas that they will be assessing as a local authority, and that's very important in local authority bidding. So firstly, there'll be some mandatory exclusions. So again, these will be simple yes or no answer questions, and there'll be questions around things like fraud and criminal activity, money laundering, and things like barred directors, and director misconduct, business misconduct. Clearly, if you answer yes to any of those questions, you will be excluded from the process, as you will not be seen as a suitable supplier. So they're mandatory exclusions. Then the council will have what are called discretionary exclusions. So they've got their discretion to sort of say, well, okay, something's not quite right, but actually we could allow that because. So an example of that might be there may have been CCJs, county court judgments against the director, but they've been repaid. In that instance, the council has a choice as to whether to still allow the company to remain in the process or not. So mandatory and discretionary exclusions. They'll then ask information about your financial suitability as a potential supplier. And sometimes, often, local authorities will have a minimum turnover requirement they feel is appropriate for a potential supplier to be able to deliver what they want. So they might say, for example, the minimum turnover threshold is 100,000. It's not black and white. So if you're a company, for example, and your turnover is 90,000, but you've got a strong bid that you're putting in elsewhere, it'll be within their discretion to keep you in the process. However, if your turnover is 10,000, then to be frank, it's going to be very difficult for them to include you because you don't have the scale, you don't have the size in terms of the types of suppliers they're looking to work with. They'll ask for details of your turnover. They'll ask for your financial year end, details of your bankers and accountants. If you're a slightly larger supplier, they might run a credit check on your organization. And again, typically, these are external credit reference agency assessments, and they're assessed high, medium, low, and they'll have the discretion if you're medium or high risk rated to, again, exclude you from the process. These are discretionary checks they'll be looking at to see, are you suitable in terms of the type of supplier that they want to work with. They'll ask for details of your insurance, and the typical 3 types of insurance cover required are employer liability, public liability, and professional indemnity insurance. And again, for the particular contract, for the particular tender, they will say a certain level of cover is required by suppliers. And you'll either tick the box to say you've already got it, or if you're successful in your bid, you're prepared to get it. Someone at the event at Luton Airport last week asked, do you score more highly if you already hold the cover versus willing to get it? And the answer is generally no. So essentially, if you're prepared to obtain the level of cover that's required, you'll score exactly the same as someone who's got the cover in place. And then finally, there'll be some additional sort of suitability clauses. And they'll ask you as an organization, are there any material reasons that you know that you can't meet the terms of this contract? Perhaps you don't quite have the expertise, perhaps there are concerns around capacity, you're working on a big project at the moment, you've got the ability to do it, but you couldn't do it now, for example. So you'll be asked to confirm that you've complied with all these questions and requirements to take you to the next stage. So let's look at these technical method statements, as they're called. And this is where you build up the key bit, if you like, of your tender response. And you'll see down the column on the right, there's a weighting. And I'm sure you know what that means, but that shows how important each section is to the contracting authority and also how they will score you based on those different sections. So in this case, again, as I said, this was a contract that Branduin were asked to bid for to provide training business support services for the council. So they asked for details of, basically how you're going to do the work, what training we will provide, how we'll mitigate any risks or challenges, what our contingency arrangements are. So to give you an example of that, we held a Meet the Buyer event last year. We're going to hold it face-to-face. It's the day of a train strike, so we had to take it online in terms of Zoom. So you have to basically have details of how you'll provide the service they want, if things aren't going to work or potentially there might be a problem, how you'll overcome those risks, how you'll overcome those challenges. And as you can see, that's a key part. 25% of the scoring is weighted towards that service delivery element. They'll ask for a mobilization plan. So all well and good saying you can do all these great things, but the question is how? How are you going to do that? What are the key milestones? Who's going to be responsible? So you need to have some sort of, in its simplest form, project plan, Excel spreadsheet. You might have experience of running projects, so you might be using, well-known project management methodology, but you've got to have a plan to show how you're going to manage that process. They'll also then ask you about the management structure of your organization. Who would be the person responsible for delivering the program? What's their competence? What's their qualifications? What's the relevant experience of key people that are going to be working on the contract? And like I said earlier, what are the business continuity arrangements in place if things potentially go wrong? They'll then ask you things about what's relevant experience of your organization. So have you delivered similar programs? Have you done them face-to-face and online? So if you go and you get really bored and look on our website for brand new, I'm joking, but it's a serious point, you'll see we have numerous case studies and numerous details from very satisfied clients, chambers of commerce, local authorities, where we've done similar work, and we can say this is what we did, and this is the training we provided, these are the organizations we worked with, this was the contract value, these are the services we provided. And like I said earlier, that all adds weight to your argument. It's evidence, because like I said, it's all well and good saying you can do things, but actually proving it with evidence, particularly independent evidence, so much more powerful, which again is why you can see it's 20% weighted in terms of the scoring. Then they asked us questions like, how will we engage a wide variety of businesses? How will we encourage SMEs to participate in this business support program? What's our experience of working with companies, facing economic challenges? What are the outcomes of the contracts that we're working on, and what the outcomes to be achieved? How will we demonstrate we can meet those things? And also, typically there'll be a question around equality. So they'll say, how do you encourage and engage with Black, Asian, minority ethnic companies, for example, excluded communities? Have you worked on contracts where you've managed to successfully engage those types of businesses as well? Because we're an inclusive authority, as all authorities are now. We want to encourage people from organizations who perhaps may sometimes feel they're excluded from these processes. So as you can see, there's a huge amount of technical detail that's required in these method statements. And finally, they'll ask you for details of whether or not you pay the London living wage. You'll have watched on the news, I'm sure, the cost of living crisis, to put it mildly, and how people are struggling. And they want to work with ethical suppliers who are prepared to pay their employees, the London living wage. So that's an important thing to bear in mind as well. So you can see there is a lot of information required, but as long as you adopt it and work on it in a structured way, then essentially you're going to be moving down the right track to submitting a winning bid. So just to finish off on the weighting, as you can see, focus your efforts on the areas which obviously have the highest weighting. And again, make sure if there is a word count restriction, so if it, for example, it's a 500 word count restriction on service delivery, don't put so again, someone asked this last week at this event, but if I put 200 words in, will I be lower scored? Well, the simple answer is probably yes, because the fact that they've said you've got 500 words to cover this section, they would expect that you'll fill maybe not 500 necessarily, but 450, 470, to make sure you've covered the issue fully. So focus and concentrate your effort on those areas which are more highly weighted in terms of scoring. So let's get into the meat. As I said, it basically stands for most economically advantageous tender. And what it does is it allows the contracting authority to take account of various criteria: quality, technical expertise, sustainability aspects in the tender, price as well, when they're overall looking at awarding the tender to the right supplier. And the contracts are always evaluated based on a weighting of price and quality. The examples here show, so for example, in the first bullet point, it's saying it's 75% price, it's 25% quality. So on that case, you can see that the key driver is the most competitive price. not in every tender, but in this example. So it might be, as an example, I don't know, a cleaning contract that they're looking to tender for, and they take a view that, you know, every cleaner can do a good cleaning job, so cheapest one wins to a point, as long as they can meet all the other criteria. However, in a more technical tender, like for example, in the business support program example we've just been through, there'll be a higher focus on quality. So what they're saying is there, you've got to prove that you can deliver a very high quality service. And actually, if you're not the cheapest, that's fine. You know, the price is only 25% weighted in terms of, you know, the overall assessment. And you can see down the right-hand side of the slide, there's a whole host of different assessment criteria that they'll look at. They look at quality, price, and as I said, not necessarily cheapest price, but right price. So when I say right price, you need to know what's the price in the market. You need to know what's the pricing of your competitors. So you put in the right price. They want to know what's your technical ability to actually deliver the service, how experienced is your team. Social value we'll talk about, environmental benefits, massive, massive issue at the moment, and will continue to be so. Are you innovative in terms of coming up with new solutions they haven't thought of? And key, are you able to deliver to their timescales? So there's a whole host of assessment criteria they'll look at. And it's a good way, as you can see, in terms of, you know, in a structured way, scoring tenders and then coming up with an average rank score for each section and then comparing. So let's actually talk a little bit more about evaluation methodology and how that's assessed. So I said earlier that local authorities, government departments will invariably have a procurement department running the tender process on behalf of the end user within the council. And essentially, they're just people like you and I, and they're looking to assess the tender responses in the most efficient way possible. And they'll have a table like this. Here's an example, essentially. And they'll score every response based on something similar to this. So of course, in your tender response, you're striving for that good or excellent rating. And I won't go through them all in detail because you're all big enough to read for yourself. But to score excellent, it says things like you need to exceed the required standard, go over and above what they've asked for. You've answered the questions with precision, they're relevant. You've included innovative improvements. You've perhaps come up with ways of demonstrating how you'll add value. So, you know, in those situations, always talk about benefits, that's for sure. And if you move down the slide, essentially you'll see that basically, you know, if you're going to score poorly, you either haven't answered the question, and you've answered it inadequately, you haven't provided enough detail. The thing to remember with local authorities is that they will do this process in a completely objective and transparent way. There was an example that someone spoke to me about a couple of weeks ago about a company that tendered for some business, and essentially they were huge. The company were massive. They didn't share the name, but it's obviously a blue chip name. And they felt that, you know, we're too big to answer this question, that question. It's too obvious. You know, why would we answer questions about X, Y, Z? And they didn't. And guess what? They were rejected from the process, not because they probably couldn't actually handle the contract and manage what was being required very effectively. They just didn't answer the questions. So you have to answer the questions and answer them thoroughly. A lot of the detail behind what to put in questions like, you know, responses, how to answer to score highly, I cover in my other two webinars. I'll give you details of those in a moment. So this sort of structured process, it's very helpful when they're trying to assess, perhaps they've got two or more, say they've got two very high quality tender responses and they need an objective way of evaluating them. This scoring plus the weighting system is a very good way for them to do that. So let's just run through a tender timetable. This was the timetable for the actual tender that we submitted, as I said. And you can see this is actually quite an aggressive timetable. When I say aggressive, it's quite a short timetable in terms of local authorities. So, you know, for example, they've published a tender. I'll talk to you about where that happens, how you can find them, get alerts, that sort of thing. They might then say, okay, there's time for them to come and visit the site or you to visit sites. There'll be a clarification deadline if there are any, excuse me, any particular questions that you want to ask. If other people have asked questions to clarify, make sure you read the responses so you don't ask the same question again, look unprofessional. There'll be a submission deadline. As I said to you, always work to the day before. You'll run out of time, trust me. They'll then have a period of evaluation, which will go quiet. Often that stretches out longer than they expect. They'll then announce a short list typically, and they'll ask perhaps 3 or 4 potential suppliers to come in to present. And then there'll be the notice of award and the contract start date. So in terms of timelines, the stuff down the right, do read the tender timetable carefully. Don't leave it to the last minute. Plan well in advance. If you've got the luxury of having some people to support you, mobilize that team to help you from the start, allocate responsibilities, write it down. I'm a fan of writing stuff down. Have a little simple Excel spreadsheet which details everything that needs to be done and the timelines and who's responsible. So as you can see, the timetable can be a little bit longer in the local authority sector, and it often does slip for a variety of reasons which are sometimes outside their control. Okay, let me have a quick sip. Whenever any authority is contracting some services, they've got a job that needs to be done, a problem that needs to be solved. So when you're looking at this, you're thinking about tendering, always focus on what the buyer wants, not on what you want to sell. Because typically, a lot of companies think, there's lots of great stuff we do. The local authority have asked for these 2 things. Let's just tell them everything, and some of it will stick. Well, like I said, the evaluators are busy, so be specific. Like it says on the slide, do things like defining your offer around what jobs the local authority needs to get done. What are their desired outcomes? And basically, how are you going to help meet those outcomes and develop a winning bid? So I have been talking a lot, and you've been listening, thankfully. So it's time for you to do a little bit of work. So here, what I'd like you to do, talking about jobs to be done, is think about, write down what it is you do and how it can potentially help the local authority or a potential customer to get a job done that will lead to an outcome they want to achieve. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. An outcome might be that the authority want to increase, the authority want to increase the number of ethnic minority employees. That might be an outcome. And so the job they need to get done is improving, changing, or remodeling their recruitment process. So how would you help with that, for example? And think about what are their sort of functional objectives, day-to-day objectives, and also their longer-term strategic goals. And talk about benefits always, don't talk about features. And the other thing to be aware of is have a process that is adaptable, because you need to adapt your offer, your process to meet the local authority's need. They won't adapt, you need to. So I'll give you 30 seconds or so just to think about that and maybe write something down. You can put it in the chat if you want, or just write it down. So think, as I say, how your offer and service can potentially help a local authority meet an outcome or get a job done. I'll give you 30 seconds or a minute for that to have a little think. Like it says at the bottom, if you can define your bidding tendering strategy around getting jobs to be done, it'll allow you to make sure that you align your perhaps sometimes limited resources to what needs to be done by the local authority. Okay, let's move on. Hopefully it's given you a chance to have a little bit of a think of how that might work for you in your own organisation. Let's talk a little bit about your tender business model. And this all comes from a business technique called the business model canvas. You may or may not have heard of it, but essentially it's a very effective and succinct way of assessing your business on one piece of paper. So if you haven't heard of business model canvas, I'd encourage you to go away and Google it after and have a look and see, because it's a very good way of analysing a business, like I say, on one bit of paper. And it covers various things that you'll see in the box. So let's just touch upon those briefly. So desirability, your customers need to want your products, want your service. Otherwise, of course, you'll have no sales. You need to be able to implement in a way that's feasible. You need to be able to demonstrate that you can actually put your service, put your offer in place in a way that makes logical sense, I guess. It's got to be financially viable. So you need to make sure the pricing is right, your cost structure is right, and make sure you make sufficient profit. And like I said, ultimately, you need to be adaptable, particularly from the sustainability aspect. That is gathering so much more weight now, as I'm sure you all know. So you need to think about things like purpose in terms of basically the impact of what you do has on the planet as a whole. Because, you know, we've got this climate change summary going on at the moment, and it's not going away. Whatever you feel about climate change, there is an issue in some shape or form. So I guess what I'm saying is develop your thinking in terms of strategy, in terms of innovation around things that are ecologically beneficial, you know, and make a positive impact rather than a negative impact. It doesn't have to be something huge, but it needs to be something that demonstrates, again, you've thought about this issue. So one other little exercise for you to have a think about, I'm sure you've all seen, perhaps done SWOT analysis on your own businesses, but in this situation, I just want you to spend a minute thinking about it from the perspective of you putting in a tender. So what are the areas where you particularly have strengths as an organization when submitting tenders? What are the areas where you would be able to score highly? What's strong about it? Do you have lots and lots of case studies? So, for example, I worked with a business on another program, and their sort of strength, their USP, was they had more 5-star Google bids than any of their competitors. That's a strength. That's a significant, genuine USP. Obviously, the flip side of that is have a little think about where you wouldn't score so highly. What are your weaknesses? How can you put in plans perhaps to overcome those weaknesses? And then obviously think about what are the opportunities? What are contracts that are high value? Do you have a prestigious customer you deal with? I've got a client, an SME who I work with on this program, and I won't go into the details for sensitivity reasons, but she and her company, she's a one-man band at the moment, but she deals with some very, very high blue chip names. And guess what? That adds a huge amount of credibility in terms of if she's bidding and tendering for future contracts, to be able to put those names on her tender as case studies. And then think obviously about threats. Think about your competition. How do you differentiate yourself to show that you can stand out from the competition? So I'll just give you again 30 seconds to have a little think about that, perhaps write a few things down. I appreciate that I'm not giving you a huge amount of time, but we have only got an hour or so this morning. So do have a little think about this, even, you know, as I will ask you to put something in the chat when you do, it's your choice. Maybe your action is to complete the SWOT analysis, because if you think about these things properly, and I'm not trying to be condescending, if you think about these things carefully and plan, and by writing stuff down, guess what? It forces you to think more carefully about what you're doing. It'll all help you when you get to a point where you're looking to submit a tender, a bid. So it's worth doing this hard work in getting your company ready, getting your business ready to tender. I'll just give you a few more seconds to think about that. Okay, let's crack on. I'll leave you to do that as homework. Let's talk a bit about social value. This is a term that if you haven't heard, I'm sure most of you or many of you will, is gaining huge more prominence and profile, particularly in public sector bids, but in local authority bids as well. So it's essentially, as you can see from the first bullet point, it's defined as improvements made to the social, economic, and environmental well-being of a local area when tendering, essentially. So it's talking about how do you help build community wealth. And all local authorities, including Hammersmith and Fulham, will have a plan to help build community wealth and work in a socially responsible way. So you can see down the bottom, there are some various examples of different ways of promoting social value. There could be some environmental benefits. It could be that you're helping disadvantaged people to get involved in certain things they wouldn't otherwise get involved with. Great example, I worked with a company in Brent earlier in the year, and what they do is they help disadvantaged young people get better in terms of understanding business and how to get into that. Now, what a great example of social value. Very simple example, someone mentioned to me a couple of weeks ago. It was a painter and decorator putting in a tender bid, and they put in there that they would help paint the local community centre, which hadn't been painted for 10 years. So it doesn't always have to be something massively complex, but have a social value policy, because again, most local authorities will ask you to have certain policies in place, and you can do all this groundwork before. And when I say have a social value policy in place, it doesn't have to be 20 pages. Go online, have a look at some templates. It could be a one-pager, but make sure that you don't trip up when you're bidding and tendering, when it says you need to have a social value policy, when it says you need to have a business continuity plan, when it says, as it does do now, I think in a lot of these contracts, an anti-slavery policy. You might think, why is that relevant to me? As long as you can tick those boxes to make sure you've got something and there's some substance behind it, you'll get through to the next stage. And that's always the intention in any bid tender response, to get through to the next stage. So don't ignore social value. A lot of larger contracts, for example, any contract value over 100,000, it's mandatory for there to be 10% of that contract allocated to social value. So, for example, construction companies, they have to have 10% social housing. It's an example of how they, to help, less advantaged people get on that property ladder. Okay, here's a little proverb for you. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. If you're anything like me, I'm the sort of person that I don't really like to delegate, because I think I can do it faster, I can do it better, I can do it quicker. I don't have to worry about managing other people. I can get it done better myself. But actually, I can't do everything myself. There are certain areas I don't have the relevant knowledge, I don't have the relevant experience. It's helpful if I've got a team around me. So that's the point I'm trying to make there, is that, yeah, it's sometimes quicker to go it alone, but actually go further if you can work with a partner. So let's just touch upon that briefly. So consortium bidding, because that's one of the challenges that SMEs say, we're too small. Well, join forces. Consortiums are basically two or more organisations who basically individually think we can't meet the requirements individually, but if we join forces with someone else, we could then collectively put together a winning bid. The things to remember is the local authority, they'll only contract one legal entity, so one member of the consortium has to act as the lead bidder. The local authority will only pay the lead bidder, and they have to be seen to be delivering the service. And there are various legal structures that you can put in place for reducing a consortium, like a special purpose vehicle, SPV, a partnership agreement, or just simply a bid with a lead partner nominated people as subcontractors. Things to think about under the considerations: what are the legal arrangements, who's making key decisions, who's going to manage that process, what are the exit arrangements for partners, what are the financial penalties if people don't meet their responsibilities. But the key thing, if you're working and putting in the bid as a consortium, is that the response you put in has to read as if it's one document. So even if you've got 3 different subcontractors producing different parts of the bid, it has to read as one single document, as if it's been written by one person. And you can get external bid specialists to do that for you if it helps, and they'll manage that process for you as well. And so, yeah, if you're not big enough on your own, think about how, or not just necessarily not big enough, if you don't have the ability to do everything in a tender, then think about who you could partner up with to give yourself a better chance of having a strong bid. Another thing we often hear when I'm talking to companies is that, once you're in with the local authority, it's impossible to get the existing supplier out. And I grant it's a bit more difficult, but as I said earlier, every tender will be looked at objectively. Of course, if you're a strong existing supplier, you've produced a good, you've done what you said, you've produced a good service, you've met all the outcomes, you'll be in a strong position. But there are ways that you can break into that market. So first is try and understand and research how embedded the existing supplier is, what they've earned from the contract, how long they've worked for them, what sort of services they provide. And that sort of information is out there in various different guises. You can find it on things like Find a Tender. Second bullet point is a key one, start to build those relationships with the local authority long before the contract renewals are coming up. Know the contract end dates well in advance. This is not a quick fix, quick win. You know, you might want to bid for a contract that's coming up in 12 months. We'll start having those conversations now, getting your policies in place, getting your case studies, your evidence. Make sure you've got a unique selling proposition that is directly relevant for the contract you're going to be bidding for. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Price your bids competitively. Certainly to break into the market, you might have to go in under the market price initially. I certainly know we used to do that as a bank with our contracts in the past, just to get ourselves in the door. So you might sort of give them a 6-month discount, for example, just to sort of force them to think, okay, it's worth us being carefully about bringing in this new supplier, because of course it does create more time and effort. And again, think about alternatives to actually directly bidding yourself. You don't have to be the one. Find a partner that's worked with the authority before to mount a sort of more serious challenge, if that's like, on the existing supplier. So there are ways of breaking in, albeit, you know, it does take a bit more time and effort. Okay, conscious of time, but we're roughly on track, maybe 5 minutes over. Let me just give you a few tips and suggestions to get you started, because there's lots of big picture theory stuff and you're probably thinking, wow, there's a lot to do. But you know what? With proper planning, you can do it. So things like start with a specific sector, a specific area, define what's called your value proposition. Again, if you've not come across that term, we do run webinars on those as well. You can get the links for the ones we've done in the past and we'll share those with you. Focus your effort where you get maximum bang for your buck, maximum return on investment. You know, if you need to subcontract, then do that. Develop those case studies. Think big but start small. If you've never tendered for a contract before the local authority, perhaps don't go in for one of the largest contracts. Excuse me one moment. Certainly the process for those smaller value contracts is typically not as complex, it's not as restrictive. And Hammersmith and Fulham have produced details of the sort of services that they'll be contracting for over the next 12, 18 months. And they'll share more of that with you at the Meet the Buyer event. So you can say, actually, there's a contract, it's 20,000, we could do that, let's put in the bid for that. Now, get yourself set up for a tender alert, you know, go to networking opportunities, look on LinkedIn, go to these things like Meet the Buyer events, because you know, you'll get a lot of chance to meet, talk, and find out what's going on in their market. And think about how you can differentiate yourself, whether it's from the social value aspect, whether it's from the perspective of, you know, having a very unique selling proposition. And think not only about can you do it, but can you win it? Because it will take you a bit of time and effort. So make sure if you're going to do it properly. Give yourself the maximum chance of success. Okay, so we're coming to a conclusion. So overall, to summarize, with a tender response, you've satisfied all the ITT requirements, you've read the instructions carefully, you've answered that question about why you, what's different about you and your organization, why should the local authority pick you as a supplier? You've focused on the customer. Remember, it's all about them. You've demonstrated how you can add value, solve a problem, get a job done. You've priced it properly. You provided a compelling solution, a well-written, consistent proposal, succinct, but easy to understand, all helps the evaluators. You made sure you hit those evaluation key points, and you provided evidence, back up what you're saying, to make what you say more believable. If you can tick those things off in your proposal, you'll be well on your way to submitting a winning bid. Where can you find all these opportunities? Well, Hammersmith and Fulham, they use Capital e-sourcing. It's one of these electronic portals where they put all their contracts and tenders in place. And there are wider ones for London and nationally, and a number of other ones as well. There are a lot of these tender portals. I would say get registered for the relevant ones, certainly, but in conjunction with that, talk to the local authority, build your relationship, start having conversations with them, and we will signpost you to the right people to say, look, we're this type of organisation, we're a painter and decorator, we provide sort of social care support, to see and understand what's coming up in the next 12, 18 months. And then you can start planning around that tender response. Like I said, there are a number of different webinars we run as part of the program. We're at the sort of second half of the program now. So we're doing the public sector one now. We'll be running one in a couple of weeks' time, which is all about the circular economy. And I mean, you may have come across that term. It's all about things like climate change, tackling global challenges, sustainability, recycling, how to better manage and use resources. And as a small company, you might think that's not relevant to me, but it sounds a bit cheesy, but everyone can do their bit. And you can, by demonstrating that, you put yourself in a stronger position. And also how to develop key partnerships. We've got the Meet the Buyer event. I'll spend 30 seconds on that in a moment. And also, we've got these two specific bid writing webinars that I've run and will be running again in February next year. So there are links to all the ones we've done in the past. If you want those, just let me know. All these webinars are run by people who are expert in their field, I guess, and they've also got direct relevant business experience. So it's not just theoretical, it's practical as well. So the link there is at the bottom. Get yourself registered if you think that will help. I mentioned we've got this Meet the Buyer event lined up for January. Here's a sort of outline of the schedule, but essentially it's two or threefold. We'll have key people there from the council. We'll have key decision makers, influencers. We'll have the head of procurement, the head of the economic and business development department. We'll have representation from the private sector. And it'll give you, as potential suppliers, a chance to first of all meet them, because that's always a good start, and ask any questions you want of the local authority panel. Like I said, what's coming up? What's relevant to you? Where can you find out more? Who should you talk to? All those types of things. So I definitely encourage you to come along to that. It's local in Hammersmith, just by the station, not too far away, and more details to follow on that in due course. And finally, I've mentioned these one-to-one sessions that are also sponsored by the council. They're very structured sessions in so much as there are two sessions. The first one's very much a fact find, understanding what your key challenges around bidding and tendering are. And out of that first session will come actions for you to work on in between that and the second session. And they're typically 4 to 6 weeks between the two sessions. We've put about 70 businesses through the program as well. We still have a few spaces left. So you haven't basically had a one-to-one with myself or one of my teams, please do get in touch and I'll give you my contact details on the next page. So as it said, get yourself on those one-to-one sessions. We're here to help. We're here to sort of support you and to get you to a point where you can submit what's called an expression of interest to either a local authority or perhaps, a tier 1, tier 2 private sector supplier. And the whole intention behind that support and training is to get you to a point where you can submit a winning bid. Right, so final thing, thanks for bearing with us for just a couple of minutes over time. I did say at the start, I'd ask you to sort of commit to doing something as a result of spending an hour of your precious time listening to me. So please feel free to put something in the chat in terms of what you're going to do as a result of hearing what I've been talking about in the last hour. And if you have any questions, happy to answer those in the chat as well. If you have any feedback on what you've heard, obviously, we'd be delighted to hear that. So I'll just give you 2 or 3 minutes to finalise on that front. And don't be shy, someone's got to go first. So please feel free to put something in the chat to say you're going to do something, because I do tend to work on the basis that you need to do something different as a result of what you've heard, rather than just listen and then go back to your day job. So I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it interesting. There's lots more support available, whether it's through one-to-ones, whether it's through the webinars or the Meet the Buyer session, and we'd be delighted to hear from you and try and help you get a chance to win some of those larger contracts with local authorities. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to, as I say, put something in the chat if you want to, that would be appreciated. If not, good luck with the bidding and tendering, and we'll be looking forward to talking to some, if not all of you, in the one-to-one sessions. I'll give you a couple of minutes before I just wrap things up. Good to see something coming through on the chat. I've just put my details in, so you don't have to be first. Yeah, thanks very much for. Oh, hi, Chanel. Thanks very much for putting in, including a social value plan. That's good. Yeah, definitely would like to do some one-to-ones. We'll be doing one soon, Chanel. That's for sure. Good to see you on the session. As I said, no need to be shy. Yep. SWOT analysis. Yep. Good stuff. Yep. As I say, commit to do something. So, you know, something happens as a result of what you've heard. I'll put my email details in the chat as well. So like I said, if you want to book a one-to-one session, if you've got any questions, if you want to discuss anything, get copies of the previous recordings of the sessions, then we're very happy to provide that. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I'll wrap things up now because we're just about over time by 5 minutes. I'm a stickler for trying to keep things on time. I hope you found the session useful, interesting, and valuable, and you'll take away something that will help you in your quest to increase the bidding and knowledge that will give you a chance to win those bigger tenders with the local authority. So thank you very much again, and look forward to hearing from some of you and having one-to-ones over the next few weeks.